In the Ted Bundy documentary, we saw that Ted's life was like a horribly written script. It was probably the worst I've ever read. Well, the bio of Steve Jobs comes close to that. For those that are new here, I suggest you watch the videos prior to this. There we show that other celebrities such as Tupac, O.J. Simpson, and other mainstream events were just an Intel creation. For those that think I only focus on the black community, I will step away from the black celebrities that you think are on your side. I will edit a string of papers exposing people like Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, and Steve Jobs. I will show you that they're just another Intel creation. As for Steve Jobs, I read about his life, and I realized how easy it would be to expose him. It was absurd, and I could see through it. It had all the signs of being written by a committee in Langley. Full of obvious holes, contradictions, and non sequiturs, plus a total disrespect for its audience. We will start at the beginning. I will show you everything I see. Like most, they are hiding his roots, as usual. His biographer is Walter Isaacson, Jewish, which is not beside the point as you will see. Isaacson is a big red flag himself, maybe the biggest. He was an editor at Time.
He's also furious at Time magazine. Tells us that, we're not nearly as good as Newsweek, that somebody, I won't name his name because he lives here, had written a horrible story about him. The sort of impatience and petulism that you sometimes saw in Steve Jobs was connected to the passion and the perfectionism.
And later CEO of CNN. Once the CEO of the Aspen Institute. He is also on the board of United Airlines, Harvard University, Tulane University, Bloomberg Philanthropies, and the Carnegie Institute for Science. I should probably be exposing him instead of Jobs, seeing that he has and always had a lot more power, but his positions expose him with no help from me. That list tells you just about everything you need to know. Jobs is a bit more cloaked. Just be aware that Isaacson has written a lot of books, and in my opinion, they are all misdirection from cover to cover. That's what these people do, and he does a lot of it. The first thing Isaacson is hiding from you is that Jobs is Jewish. We get a lot of BS about adoptive parents, but for myself, I am not prone to believe it.
Very little, Mr. Mushnick!
But first, they admit Jobs' birth mother is Nee Shebel. On Jobs' mother's side, we also get the name Ziegler, which can be either German or Jewish. Considering that neither Jobs nor his real mother or sister look German, yet look Jewish instead, I think we know which way to lean here. I trust my own eyes over anything Walter Isaacson tells me. I will be told Jobs looks like what he does because his real dad was Syrian. His mother looks like she is from somewhere in the Middle East as well. She is supposed to be German and Swiss, growing up on a farm in Wisconsin. But the bios push you away by focusing on his adoptive parents. For some reason, Wikipedia gives us a whole paragraph on the roots of his adoptive parents, telling us his adoptive dad was from a Calvinist household. How could it possibly matter what his adoptive dad's roots were, since he shared no blood with his son? Also note the name of the town they gave you as the location of the family farm. Germantown, Wisconsin. Germantown. Could they be any less subtle and more obvious as they hypnotize you? Not only was Jobs' real mom said to have come from a farm, but his adoptive dad was also from a farm. They were both German. Watch the mind trick. Not Jewish, but German. We also get the first CIA numerology markers. Jobs' adoptive parents were married in 1946, the year the CIA was being formed. In 1967, we are told the Jobs moved into a 3-bedroom house in Los Altos, an even richer neighborhood. They weren't renting, they bought it. How did a repo man do that? They admit the new home was embedded in an environment that was even more heavily populated with engineering families than the Mountain View home. See? Engineers, not repo men. Then we get this lovely story. Steve Jobs claims that when he was 12, Jobs was given a summer job by Bill Hewlett of Hewlett-Packard, after Jobs called him to ask for parts for an electronics project.
I always call him up. I called up, this will date me, but I called up Bill Hewlett when I was 12 years old, and he lived in Palo Alto. His number was still in the phone book. And he answered the phone himself. He said, yes? He said, hi, I'm Steve Jobs. I'm 12 years old. I'm a student in high school, and I want to build a frequency counter. And I was wondering if you had any spare parts I could have. And he laughed, and he gave me the spare parts to build this frequency counter, and he gave me a job that summer in Hewlett-Packard, working on the assembly line, putting nuts and bolts together on frequency counters. He got me a job in the place that built them. And I was in heaven.
Right. Just so you know, Hewlett-Packard was incorporated in 1947. Note the date. Steve Jobs was 12. Bill Hewlett was CEO of Hewlett-Packard in 1968 when Steve Jobs allegedly called him. Do you really think the CEO of this major company spent all day on the phone talking to 13-year-old kids who called up to ask for spare parts? Beyond that, do you think 12 or 13-year-old kids would be allowed to work on a factory assembly line? Have you ever heard of unions? Have you ever heard of child labor laws? According to the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, children under 18 cannot work most manufacturing jobs, which include assembly lines. They can only work agricultural jobs or part-time jobs like paper routes and so on. Exemptions can be made for family businesses, but assembly lines are not family businesses.
To protect its children, which allow exploitation of children for profit. Therefore, I come before you publicly now to urge the ratification of the Child Labor Amendment.
Again, we see these story writers at Langley either being incredibly ignorant about the outside world or assuming you are. Jobs then allegedly went to Homestead High School, which was not a working-class high school. It was for engineers' kids, not for sons of repo men. His high school bio is weird like the rest since we don't find him taking a lot of math or science or experimenting in a basement lab. Instead, we find him smoking, dating an artist girl, taking AP English and creative writing, reading Shakespeare, and so on. In his senior year, he allegedly took an English class at Stanford and worked on a film project with his girlfriend. This is all very strange and is nothing but a series of red flags. But it gets weirder. We were told during the summer, Brennan, Jobs, and Steve Wozniak found an advertisement posted on the De Anza College bulletin board for a job that required people to dress up as characters from Alice in Wonderland. Brennan portrayed Alice while Wozniak, Jobs, and Al portrayed the White Rabbit and the Mad Hatter. That's your next clue, and it's a 2-for-1. First of all, it shows us Steve Jobs, the actor. Second, it is another pointer to intelligence, since intelligence loves Alice in Wonderland. Just Google on Alice in Wonderland CIA and see what comes up. Basically, Intel used that book and others such as the Oz books as the basis for techniques in some of their projects, including Bluebird, Artichoke, and Monarch. Here, they are simply using the reference as another marker. It says to the right readers, we are here. We were told he would start visiting Steve Wozniak once Wozniak started at Berkeley. Next, Jobs enrolled at Reed College. Reed is in Oregon. It is very expensive, quite exclusive, and it is a liberal arts college, not a science or tech college. If Jobs had the kind of grades necessary to get into Reed, you would have expected him to go to Caltech instead. Regardless, it is not the sort of place you would expect Jobs to go, at least not from his mainstream bio and subsequent career. However, given what we have discovered, it is not so strange after all. This is the only college I know of that requires you to study Jewish history, which should get you on the right track here. It is not clear how Jobs could afford Reed. The tuition at the time was about the same as Harvard, being around $9,000 a year. Steve Jobs did not receive a scholarship. Perhaps he didn't qualify for one. His dad Paul must have been repossessing a boatload of items. Maybe he repossessed a couple of aircraft carriers.
Let me tell you what happened.
The next ridiculous story, we are told Steve Jobs walked into Atari with something Wozniak had lent him, and Olin Bushnell personally gave him a job as a technician. Right, because it just works out that way. To thank Bushnell for this unbelievable act of generosity, Steve Jobs quit a few months later to hitchhike around the West Coast. Yes, Jobs continues the path of a successful businessman. Bold, brilliant, brutal, and fake.
I'm pretty sure my Paul is Spider-Man.
6 months later, he is back at Atari. So nice of them to give him the summer and fall off after working for about 4 months. A year later, he quit again and went to India with his friend Daniel Kotke. We are supposed to believe he had been reading Ram Dass while working as a technician at Atari, and now he wanted to visit. But once again, we have to ask how he afforded that. A plane trip to India is quite expensive. Jobs couldn't have saved much, since he was working for about 3 months a year. The only thing Steve Jobs learned in India was how to drop acid and how to shave his head. This is not beside the point, because that is exactly what Ram Dass was created to do for you. Steve Jobs tells us LSD was one of the most important things that ever happened to him, which is one reason Steve Jobs was created.
But at one point he turned to me and he said, you know, LSD is one of the 2 or 3 most significant things that I've ever experienced.
It was also a very, spiritual time in my life. Definitely taking LSD was one of the most important things in my life.
Seems like they wanted to make him a drug pusher like the rest. Although Steve Jobs was now a navel-gazing Buddhist with a required bamboo mat and kettle of fish, he went back to work at Atari. We aren't told why Atari would welcome someone back with such a horrendous record of showing up for work, but even so, they admit Jobs still had no skills. What exactly did Jobs do at Atari, as a technician? Screw boards together again. He appears to have been unsure which side of a circuit board was up, hiring Wozniak to do all the work for him. Why was Steve Jobs such a genius again? This is when Jobs and Wozniak allegedly began selling blue boxes, allowing free long-distance phone service. Right. Strange that they were never charged with that, although it was a felony, and they admitted doing it. Like all the rest we have studied, the laws apparently didn't apply to them. Ma Bell didn't care. She was happy to have Jobs and Wozniak ripping her off. Wozniak finally got around to doing something in 1976, we were told, though Jobs was still just mooching off him. Wozniak allegedly invented the Apple I, although this is the only picture we get of it. Isn't that impressive?
And I introduce a man like a father to me, Steve Jobs.
Here is the story of the beginning of Apple. Steve Jobs approached a local computer store, the Byte Shop, who said they would be interested in the machine, but only if it came fully assembled.
One day I walked into a Byte Shop, the first Byte Shop in Mountain View, and Paul Terrell, the then owner of the Byte Shop, said he would like to take 50 of these computers. And I saw dollar signs in front of my eyes. But he had one catch, which was that he wanted them fully assembled and tested, ready to go, which is a new twist. So we spent the next 5 days on the phone to distributors and convinced the electronics parts distributors around here to give us about $10,000 worth of parts on thin air, just on enthusiasm. So we got the parts and we built 100 computers and we sold 50 of them for cash and 29 days paid off the distributors. And that's how we got started.
The owner, Paul Terrell, went further, saying he would order 50 of the machines and pay $500 each on delivery. Jobs then took the purchase order that he had been given from the Byte Shop to Kramer Electronics, a national electronic parts distributor, and ordered the components he needed. So my assumption is that Jobs was placed in his position for his looks, which means he was an actor. I don't even believe he made all that money. I think they made it up, just as they have made it up with Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and many others. We now know they fake everything, from voting machines to stock market figures to government statistics and more. Before we look at Jobs' mysterious death, all the stories in between don't really interest me, because it is just a lot of BS to cover the fact that Apple, like Microsoft, was always just a front for the government. In short, the technology came out of the military, but in the 1960s, it was seen that disseminating the technology to the public would create another form of control, like television, and so they did that.
The digital revolution will benefit the country in other areas as well, and the same digital technology that drives military C4I systems is at the heart of the information systems that are reshaping business and industry.
Money could also be made, of course, but in this case, money was the secondary goal. Control was the primary goal. They didn't want to introduce the technology as a monopoly since that would look suspicious. So they needed to push at least two major companies, Apple and Microsoft. If the market had been real, you would have expected Apple and Microsoft to have attacked one another viciously, but although we get some fake stories of that, the opposite happened. Apple basically gifted its technology to Microsoft in a very weird agreement. None of that makes any sense from a business point of view. Apple should have been in the position of power there, since all it had to say is, fine, stop developing Mac applications. We will develop them ourselves and take your market. Apple had enough capital to hire all of Microsoft's people away from them and develop anything they wished to develop. Instead, they just gave Microsoft the right to all their inventions. Obviously, it was done this way because Apple and Microsoft were not created to compete. Two separate platforms were created on purpose by the government to give the appearance of competition where there was none.
Aren't you a little young to have an iPhone?
You want to go?
iSheet, copy bots.
Here we are. You would have expected Microsoft to have long since absorbed Apple or the reverse. But that isn't even close to happening, as far as we can tell. Why not? Because it isn't in the script. In fact, how was Apple Computers able to use the Apple name and trademark after Apple Corporation had already been using both for years? Remember, the Beatles company was established in 1968, while Steve Jobs' company didn't arrive until 1976. In the real business world, Apple Corporation would have won the first lawsuit, with Apple Computers having to change their name. Since that didn't happen, and since later lawsuits also didn't make any sense, we must assume both companies are fronts for intelligence. Intelligence wants them both to keep their names, so they do. It's that simple. Almost everything is a front for the Matrix, and this is just one more example. They both were founded, owned, and run by US British intelligence. Apple isn't a trademark of either company, it is a trademark of intelligence, and both companies are simply subsidiaries of intelligence.